Hello and welcome to Nashville Public Television's Educator series. My name is Rosemary and I am the Community Engagement Manager and Educator at Nashville Public Television. This is our second featured workshop developed around the Ken Burns film, The Gene, An Intimate History, and will be focused around PBS Learning Media Collection over the next couple of weeks. Today we are going to take a deeper dive into the lessons that you've been learning about over the last week through our Slack chat with our pgEd team. And later in the program we'll hear from them about how we can utilize those resources in our classrooms here in Nashville. But before I introduce the pgEd team once again, I would like to welcome our special guest expert panelist. From Meharry Medical College, we have Dr. Rana, Assistant Professor in Development of Professional and Medical Education. She is also joined by Ky'Era Actkins, a doctoral candidate for biomedical sciences. And then also joining them, we have a third panelist, Dr. Renya Gordon, Assistant Professor in Department of Otolaryngology at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, and she is also a part of Vanderbilt Genetics Institute. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. I'm so glad to have you speak with our educators.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. I want to just kind of start this conversation out with, what are we doing locally? And I would like for you guys to, introduce yourselves. We'll start with Dr. Rana on, can you share, each of you briefly, how you came into the field of genetics and what research are you doing around genetics today? Dr. Rana, we'll start with you.
Hi, my name is Dr. Tanu Rana, and like Rosemary said, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Professional and Medical Education. My master's was in biotechnology, and one of my majors was genetics and genetic engineering. And it was very heavy-handed genetic engineering, making a new construct every day, trying it out, making genetically engineered animals and all that. That got me interested very heavily into genetics. And when I was done with my master's, I was looking to do PhD into something that was more clinical, where I could actually apply these things. So from there on, my research kind of took turn towards host-pathogen relationship. And for the most of my career, I have looked into how pathogens modify host cells to infect them, and why are we not able to get rid of diseases the way we should be. And most of this research relies on altering the genetic components both in the host cell and in the pathogen, and seeing how that affects the relationship between these two. And lately, I have been very interested. Genetics takes center stage to almost everything, and we don't realize it as much as we should. So I also teach genetics to the medical and master's students at Meharry, and I try to bring it to the forefront that we've been doing genetics long before we knew genetics. Medical students they're fascinated when I tell them that matching the blood group when you're attending a patient is a form of genetics. We've been doing it for a longer time than we realize, and that just is one of my aims to, when we train these students, to make them aware of how much it plays a role in our everyday, things that we do. And there's a lot of emphasis on precision medicine now. That's another area where I like to shed a lot of light on. That gone are the days when you had one medicine for breast cancer that you gave to every breast cancer patient, or the same medicine for everyone who was coming to you with lung cancer. These days, you're doing the whole genome sequences, and looking for that one gene that's causing it, and you're planning these treatments according to the genetic response or the genetic profile of your patients, and that fascinates them, that gets them interested. They go back and they read, they come back and they ask you questions, and I feel like that should be the forefront of our education right now. So research and teaching for me are going hand in hand right now. So on the research front, I'm occupied with the host pathogen relationships, and on the teaching front, I feel as the genetics educator, it's my responsibility to make medical students aware that this is what is happening. You need to look into it. You need to go into it, and you need to pursue this branch.
Thank you, Dr. Rana. That is really the kind of the essence of what we're getting at with all of these workshops. So how perfect to have you here and a part of that conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ky'Era Actkins, Miss, I would like to introduce you next and have you speak on just what you are doing in your doctoral candidacy and researching there.
Yeah, so I have a few slides to share that kind of shows where I've been, what my research is, and hopefully what I would love to continue doing in my career. And so I graduated from high school in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and immediately after I went to the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and I majored in biology. And so ever since I was very, very young, I've always had a fascination with science. And it wasn't until the 8th grade that I knew that I wanted to continue to study genetics, and like just kind of listening to my family as I grew up about how things pass down through generations and how different diseases are prominent in different, different family members and things like that really like always captured my attention and my interest. And so right after I graduated from the University of Alabama, I came to good old Nashville, and that's where I joined the graduate program at Meharry. And my mentor is Leah Davis, who's actually in the Vanderbilt Genetics Institute at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And there I've been able to study a polycystic ovary syndrome, also known as PCOS. And so a little bit about what was touched on earlier about precision medicine, my research really tries to focus in on trying to use the resources we have with electronic health records and different genetics and genomic methods and approaches to try to understand how specifically PCOS manifests in different women. And so this disease actually is very, very difficult to diagnose. It can take up to 2 years or longer. And there's a variety of symptoms, with the main ones being polycystic ovaries, irregular menstruation, and hyperandrogenism, which usually presents itself as elevated testosterone levels, which can result in excess hair or hirsutism. It can also result in like acne due to the hormonal imbalance, as well as alopecia or male pattern balding in females. It's the leading cause of infertility, and is actually the most common endocrine disorder in women. And so we're using the medical records at the medical center at Vanderbilt, along with the genetics, to understand like what comorbidities exist in different populations of women. Specifically, I have an interest in health disparity, so looking at African-American women and Hispanic women, and seeing how things like cardiovascular diseases or obesity or different like neuropsychiatric disorders like depression and anxiety, how that actually manifests in those particular women where it's more prevalent. And then just kind of characterizing the different risk factors. And I'm very happy to be talking with you all today, because this actually marks PCOS Awareness Month, September. And so I've been working really closely with the American Society of Human Genetics, which is an amazing society that brings together all different career paths, different levels of trainees, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, clinicians, genetic counselors to come and talk about genetics research. And they have a really great program the Genetics Engagement and Education Network that actually is where the public can come and talk with different professionals within genetics to do many different activities in the classroom, or to kind of get career advice or plan a trip or create different experiments. And that's actually something that kept my interest and engagement when I was younger. I did a biotechnology class in high school where we got to extract our own DNA. We got to create a model of DNA. And so I'm sure that there are wonderful things that can be done using that platform. They also have a great program called DNA Day, where high schoolers, 9th through 12th grade, get to work on a prompt that is related to genetics and get to write it in, do the competition, and it is, I think, a great contest. I've been a judge for the past couple of years. And so those are just kind of some of the things that I've been working on, and I'm really, really excited to see how the field grows and continues to move forward, and how I can use electronic health records and genetics in the future to continue studying different health disparities and engage with the public more.
Thank you, Ky'Era. I was just looking up where we could find DNA Day. I was like, whoa. If you would share a link in our chat with our panelists there, we'd love to be able to share that. And Dr. Gordon, would you like to introduce yourself and share a little bit about what you're researching today?
Yes, I'm delighted to. So let me share my screen here. Can you see? Okay,
yeah.
Great. So my research is a little bit unconventional, but it does have a relationship with precision medicine that we've heard about from the other two panelists. So I'm really glad to be here talking to you today about what I do. So I am in the Department of Otolaryngology, and I'm involved with several different organizations on campus, and most of my current work is really focused on genetics. So I'm really happy to be here co-representing the Vanderbilt Genetics Institute. So what I do is I actually study rhythm and language, two very uniquely human traits, with scientific methods. So there are a number of reasons we can think of why rhythm may be something interesting to study from a scientific point of view. So there's huge variability in people's rhythm abilities. You may have noticed, you may know someone who just can't move in time to a musical beat. And so this is you know, there's a lot of variability even among people that are non-musicians. So that's interesting from a psychological point of view. And then in terms of human communication, we know from a large body of work that rhythm skills correlate with speech and language skills. So there are a lot of implications there for speech and language therapy, and we're starting to look at that in my lab. And another reason that rhythm matters is that making music together may actually bolster pro-social behaviors. So there's some really interesting research showing that when you bounce with babies, that they if you bounce in time with them, then they're more likely to do a helping behavior afterwards. So all of this together is sort of the basis of my research program, where in particular with my new Innovator Award, but also with some other grants that I have right now, we are trying to see what we can predict about an individual person's language skills based on a combination of genetic, neural, and behavioral biomarkers. So I'm really interested in interdisciplinarity, and just backing up a little bit to my very unusual career path. In high school, I loved music. I was doing a lot of music performance, and I also really loved math and languages. And so I ended up pursuing a Bachelor of Music and Vocal Arts with a minor in Italian. And this was at the University of Southern California. And in the final year, I was part of the first cohort of Renaissance scholars, and the quoted objective of Renaissance scholars were to be not just well-rounded, but rather to achieve breadth with depth and the extraordinary release of intellectual energy that often occurs when two widely separate fields of thought are brought together in the same mind. So I think this was like a little bit of foreshadowing for what I've ended up doing in my career, where I'm working with so many different disciplines and methods. So at the time, though, I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. So I ended up, so this is my windy path here on this slide. So I ended up living in Italy for a couple of years, and actually I have a picture here of my Italian passport. This was really my first research project, was showing my lineage, my ancestry, back to my great-grandparents and doing a request for recognition of my Italian citizenship. So that was a project that took a year and a half. It was like science training. I had to be very organized, detail-oriented, problem solve, keep all the records, do a lot of translations. And so, you know, as I was doing that, I started to think about what else I wanted to do with my life. And I didn't have any mentors or help where I was, but I did have the library. So I was living in the north of Italy, and I went to the library at the University of Trento almost every day, and I was reading papers. And I read this one paper about the neuroscience of singing. And this was really, really exciting to me. And it seemed from reading this paper that actually there was probably a lot more to discover, that this was just the beginning. So I ended up sending a cold email. So that's another lesson I've learned in my scientific training, is it's okay to send a cold email to someone that you've never talked with before. And I asked the principal investigator, the lab director from that paper, I asked for advice on what training I would need to study these things. And she actually invited me to her lab. I also sent a PowerPoint with all of my ideas for research projects, which were not the most realistic, but she could see at least that I was thinking about it. So it's okay to think about things in a field where we don't have experience yet. So I ended up staying in her lab to do a Master of Neuroscience. I really loved that work we were doing with EEG, and which I had seen in the paper, and that we continued with a couple of more papers there. And then I ended up going to Florida Atlantic University for my PhD after that, where I continued to study the neuroscience of singing. And then after that, I did a postdoctoral fellowship, at the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center here in Nashville. And my slides have a mind of their own, apparently. And I learned a lot about neurodevelopmental disabilities at that point. And then eventually I was promoted to faculty, and I founded my own lab in 2015. And we were just studying rhythm and language from behavioral neural perspectives, and we had added communication disorders into the mix. It was already several different fields, but then I got really excited about genetics and what could genetics tell us about the individual differences that we were seeing in the kids who are coming into the lab. So I was very fortunate. I was able to get an NIH Career Development Award to get genetics training, because I was not coming at this at all from this field. I'll post the link in Slack so you can see some of the research areas that we're studying in my lab. So over the past few years, we've begun several federally funded projects on the genetics of rhythm and language, and we're also organizing an international consortium on the genetics of musicality. So there's a picture of me on one of the trips that I took to learn to attend genetics workshops. So this has been really great training, and I wanted to mention a few of the opportunities to get involved locally. So if you're interested, there are lots of opportunities for children and adults to participate in research. We have through the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, you can visit the Study Finder website. I'll post this on Slack. And then my own lab is doing some several online studies that you can read about and possibly click to participate in. We also do lots of in-lab studies, but most of those are paused during COVID. But in the meantime, we have these great internet-based studies. So I'll just mention also that, like me, the whole team is highly interdisciplinary. These pictures are from a year or two and 2 years ago. But we have people from neuroscience backgrounds. They all pretty much have a love of music. Most of them have had music training. So I just wanted to show some of the instruments. We have a lot of speech language pathologists. Our SLP, Catherine Bush, also has a background with music therapy. So it continues to be very interdisciplinary. And I think music is sort of what brings us together, but then we stay for the science. We recently did a Reddit panel. I'll post that link as well. It was just my lab answering lots of questions on language, music, genetics, and the brain. So it had about 300 comments. So if you want to pull up to that with a cup of tea, it can be a good, an interesting way to read about our field. So we're doing genome-wide association studies. I don't know if you've learned about those in the courses, but it's a way that we can look at the genetic architecture of traits where they're not just linked to a single part of the genome, but they're happening all across the genome. So I can also post a link to one of our studies where we're collaborating with 23andMe to try to understand the genetic architecture of musical rhythm skills. And I just want to mention some of the lessons I've learned, that this is the advice that I give to young people, is really to study the things that interest you the most, and you can sort of round out your knowledge as you get closer to your actual career path, but to start with what those passions are. I also think it's important to note that you don't have to be a superstar in every aspect of a field in order to be successful, but you do have to develop attention to detail, theoretical understanding, problem-solving skills. And so sometimes I see students that may be discouraged. That there was a student in my lab, another graduate student, and where I was doing my PhD, who said that she was never really good at math until she got to graduate school, and then it was the type of math she was doing in graduate school just allowed her to really take off. So, you know, we can have unique combinations of skills that we don't know how we'll put those to use until later, and that's okay. It's important to not get discouraged. I think learning leadership skills early. So in my lab, we talk about corralling studies, who's going to sort of bring together all the disparate pieces of the study, who's going to know how to rally together other people on a project. That's important too. Writing has ended up being much more important than I ever thought it would be. So I do spend most of my day writing, as I'm sure my other panelists do as well. I think it's also important to note that it's not the smartest or most creative people necessarily that are the most successful. It's really persistence. So this is something that Nancy Cox, the director of the Vanderbilt Genetics Institute, has shared with me, and that I always really like to think about. Okay. And I'm trying to stop my screen sharing here. Oops.
It should be at the top of the page with a big red stop screen.
Okay. I think I'm still in the presentation mode here.
There you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So thank you all three for those introductions and overviews of what you're researching. I want to bring it back to a group conversation, so you guys can unmute yourself if you'd like. Want to just ask generally, you know, I think you each discussed it briefly about how you work to inspire your students, but maybe we'll start with Dr. Rana on just, you know, how do you, what are you doing to and reiterate how you're finding ways to connect with your students in genetics? And I know you mentioned that, you know, personalized medicine is something that you're seeing a lot of. How else is that being integrated into your professional medical focuses?
So I would like to say this, that, you know, when medical students, especially, I mean, when I say medical students, I mean MD students, when they come to the class, they are very heavily focused on, you know, passing their MLEs, getting through their exams, getting through their, you know, medical school. And the fun of learning in all of that gets left behind. So you have to generate interest. And the best way to do that, what I have found, is to start at the very beginning. So when they come in, we start with a very basic introductory course for genetics, which starts right from DNA. And then we keep building it up with protein synthesis, this and that, and we take it all the way up to, you know, genetic diseases. And that's where we start bringing in, you know, all these new precision medicine-based programs and cancers. And I very heavily rely on certain websites like the National Genomics website and all of these. And the more you give them that information, the more they want. And medical school learning is so much, you know, active learning. You have to go back and find it. You have to go back and look at these stuff. So they go back, they research these little projects that they're given to them. It's not too time consuming. They just have to look up and find that one thing that intrigues them, and then they come back with more questions. The other thing is that Meharry has their clinical trials research center they do a lot of studies with Vanderbilt that are genetic based. Like they recently wrapped up a study that involved enrolling 500 African Americans with different cancers. I think it was lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate, and one more. And they collected samples from all these patients, which were sequenced. And that's like the sample collection is done. I think sequencing is done, the studies and analysis stages of that. And the results coming out of it, and I think they just published 2 new papers. When you tell all of that to medical students, their eyes just light up that, yes, we're reading these fixed books, we're, giving our standardized tests and everything, but the world is so big. And when they read all of these things, they come back with more questions. And we have a program where after first year, they are required to do 8 weeks of research training. So that's a perfect time for them to find an interest, find somebody that does something that interests them and go train with them. That often yields us a lot of interest and a lot of questions in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great, to build it up, to slowly build the conversation. Dr. Gordon and Ms. Actkins, what do you guys have anything to add to that?
And I think she said like everything. Like it's about sharing what's out there with what we're doing with genetics. And like genetics is a very fast moving field and it's ever changing. And so just kind of exposing it to people and letting people know that there's many different facets of it. Like there's the researchers, there are the clinicians, there's the counselors, and there's all these different components that come together to kind of help with, different diseases, those that are influenced more by one gene, those that are influenced by many different genes. So I think it's just kind of educating people about, what the genetics field has to offer and how we can help kind of with our resources and what we're doing to kind of help move along within solving a cure or finding a cure and doing different things with the diseases.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement. So the excitement of working with people who have different academic backgrounds and the different viewpoints that they bring has been something that is just a constant source of energy and motivation in my lab. And I'll strategically put people together on projects that have different expertise, and they don't always completely know that at the beginning, or they're overwhelmed, there's so much to learn, and they'll come to me and they'll say, oh, I learned so much from so and so in the lab because they really know this other field, but then I was able to bring my knowledge and we worked together and we created this new thing. And I always say, yes, there's a method to the madness, right? It's really becomes worth all of the hard work and the long hours when we get that sort of magic together where we're achieving something that we just couldn't do as a single person in a single field, right? It's the crosstalk and creating new things. And the other part of it, I think for us, it's excitement is the potential applications of our research, which we have to do the basic research. We're trying to understand the genetic basis of musicality, but that's actually leading us towards some shared genetic architecture with other traits, including with language and speech, which we theorized from our other work on the behavioral level, but we hadn't looked into that genetically. So there's a potential to do something clinically impactful to help especially children who are struggling with speech and language, with lifelong speech and language disorders. So disorders that we know don't resolve. And so, maybe we could create new tools that will help those kids get more treatment earlier on, which would be really exciting.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. So I want to leave a little bit of time for our guests to be able to ask questions. And I'll just go ahead and open it to everyone now. Anyone that's attending our webinar tonight, do you have any questions for our panelists that are here in Nashville at Meharry Medical College and at Vanderbilt University Medical School? Can you put your answers in put your questions in the Q&A or raise your hand and I can unmute you so you can ask it verbally. Let's open it here. Any questions? All right, we have one from Thomas Francis. Thomas, you can talk. You want to unmute yourself? There you go.
Yes, okay. How's everyone doing today? Thank you for you all's presentation. Really enlightening. I want to know if any kind of new studies are being implemented as it relates to COVID-19.
So we have a lot of research going on for COVID-19, and that starts from, we have a researcher that's working on a possible treatment, and then we have several researchers that are studying COVID-19 at the very, very basic level, like, the receptor on the host cell that lets the COVID enter the cells. Really, their research at the COVID-19 and the host cell receptor level. Then Meharry Medical College is also participating in the vaccine trials for COVID-19, and two of the vaccines will be tested at Meharry Medical College, and those trials open, I think, October 1. The information is on the Meharry Medical College website. So we have both clinical and basic research on COVID-19 going on currently, but this is a new virus. We don't know it. We're all trying to run with it and understand it at the same time. So the studies, I would say, are still in infancy, but we're hoping that something comes out of it and we're able to come up with something soon.
Thank you.
And yeah, I'll just briefly mention that our lab co-director, Dr. Miriam Lenz, is doing a study about music making during COVID time. So it's not focused on genetics, but a lot of people are home more. A lot of people need a new something to distract them, something to help them cope. So music making behaviors may have changed, and we know that people are using music in different ways. There's the link I posted in Slack. I can post in the chat too, where you can get to that survey. And then I believe that there's a number of studies on the relationship between COVID-19 and mental health, including in Leah Davis's lab. So my collaborator and Ky'Era's PhD advisor is looking at that.
Yeah, Leah is working with a big consortium group to look at COVID-19, both at Vanderbilt, and they're all trying to figure out kind of what are the different mutations involved with COVID-19 using a genome-wide association study. So yeah, there's a lot of efforts going into studying the virus.
Wow. Thank you all for that. A last bit for questions. Is there anybody else in our viewing audience that has a question for our panelist? Give it a few minutes. I guess while we're waiting for someone to raise their hand, I'll ask a question. You guys have shared lots of different ways with the writing contest and DNA Day and different labs that are available. Would you all kind of just give a little brief overview of how educators and maybe even their classrooms could get involved with what you're doing, just as a brief synopsis of what you have shared already? Dr. Gordon, do you want to go first?
Well, I think one way is to look at some of the research that's being done here at Vanderbilt and on the campus. If people are interested in research participation, you certainly get a different view of a study from being a participant in it than from reading about it, I think. I've posted those links in the Slack. I put them in the announcements channel, if that's okay. Yeah, I guess that those are the main things people can look into, is getting involved in participation.
We actually have a few events during the year, a few research events when we invite, middle school students or mostly high school students to come visit us, like during our research day, and then during summer sometimes. I'm not sure how the next summer is going to look. But until this year, we have had several opportunities where both high school students and teachers like come to visit us in the lab and work with us. I have for past several years actually had high school teachers come for like a day or a 2-day training when they just walk through our core and we show them all the different equipments we have available and what we can do with them, and just generally answer any questions they have. So Meharry has had those opportunities available for both school students and educators.
Wow, that's really nice. That's a really great benefit to have locally. I do have one question from the audience here. Carrie's asking, she would love to know more about how Dr. Gordon's research on rhythm and music is being used. I believe you shared some stuff in the Slack chat that we have.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's definitely early days for this research. So we don't know how it will be used in the future. But we're really at the level of basic discovery, at least with the genetics. So right now, we're using some incredible methods that are available to us to help us understand whether rhythm shares some genes with other traits. So we're seeing some patterns with breathing traits, with chronotypes of being an evening person seems to be related to having better rhythm, but it's very small effect. So there's some relationship with biological rhythms and with people's ability to move to a musical beat. And, we have a lot to dig into to really understand that. Another aspect of the research that I'm doing is to try to understand language disorders in children. So we have a new algorithm that can identify language disorder in children through their electronic health records for a number of methodological reasons that's been complicated in the past. So we're going to look to deploy that. But it's all still very new. So I think we're cautiously optimistic about applications.
And I have the last question from Thomas asking if there's a way to do virtual field trips for middle schoolers in connection, I believe, with Dr. Rana's comment of showing teachers kind of what was available.
I hope so. I think, yes, that should be possible. And I can definitely look more into that and make sure that we work towards it. That should be a possibility.
Well, thank you. All right. So with that, I want to thank our panelists once more and invite you to stay for the rest of the conversation. We're going to switch over to our next presentation. And let me quickly switch over here. All right, sorry. Lots of things. So thank you again, Dr. Rana and Dr. Gordon and Ky'Era Actkins for joining us today. We are also joined by our PG educators, the Personal Genetics Education Project with Robin and Nadina, who joined us last week. And I want to, whoops, sorry, jumped ahead there. Want to invite them. We are also going to do something a little bit different today. We are going to ask everyone to join us on screen so you can ask questions to our pgEd educators. If you would like to join us on screen, please raise your hand and you'll have the option to join us. It's not necessary if you don't are comfortable with it, but please keep in mind that this meeting is being recorded and will be shared for future use on various platforms. We're going to take a quick little break while we get everyone settled. Please raise your hand if you would like to join us for this live conversation. All right, just a few minutes here. Oh, sorry. Right. All right, is everyone on? Did I miss anybody? Please unmute you should be able to unmute yourself if you need to. All right. Is there anyone that doesn't want to be on screen that I accidentally flipped over? Okay. All right. All right, welcome everyone. Okay, so Robin and Nadina, welcome. Here's your group. We also have our panelists from Meharry and Vanderbilt joining us as well. So let me just check. Is there anything else housekeeping wise? Do we have any questions? Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and I'll hand it over to Robin and Nadina to start their presentation.
Awesome, thank you. It was great hearing from our other presenters at the first part of today's session, and look forward to kind of carrying things forward here. So for those of you who I can see on here, were you able to review the materials on the PBS Learning Media site and the pgEd site from last week? Just trying to kind of gauge familiarity and where we're starting off. Okay, so it looks like kind of a mixed bag, but several people have. All right, trying to find my share screen thing here. Am I able to do that? Here we go. Make sure I'm hitting the right one. Okay, I think we should all be seeing the presentation now, right? For week 2 of the Gene Educator series. So this past week, we kind of touched on some of the resources that were available through PBS Learning Media in conjunction with The Gene and Infant History, which is just a wonderful film. And I kind of hope that you've had a chance to watch it, or if you haven't had a chance to see the whole thing yet, that you do plan to do it. I mean, it is an excellent, excellent film. We did mention last week that the entire film is currently available for streaming, which is sort of an odd situation that it's still available this far after its premiere. And Rosemary did check in with the staff at WETA about how long it was going to be up. And just so you know, they said that it will be available for streaming through June 30th of 2021 at this point. So if you are planning to, watch part of it with your students, or, assign for them to do it or whatever, you have some time. You don't have to squeeze it in the first couple weeks of school here. You could even schedule it for spring semester or however you like. But it's good information to have, to know that there. All right, so as I said, last week, we kind of looked at the pgEd lesson, that is the Introduction to Personal Genetics. This isn't technically part of the PBS Learning Media materials, but the one thing about this lesson is it kind of covers the basic information that is behind all of these other lessons that are available on PBS Learning Media. And then each of these, had the small clips from the film paired with a lesson and some activities to go along with it. The topics that we focused on this past week included personalized medicine, ancestry and identity, and then genetics and society. So some of the societal implications when we talk about, privacy rights and law enforcement and those sorts of things. So those are sort of the broad categories. Now, when we typically do this lesson live, this Introduction to Personal Genetics lesson, and we go through these things, we do an activity with the participants as we go that's called a Four Corners activity. And maybe some of you do these in your classrooms already. For those of you that I can see, does anyone do a Four Corners type of activity? Yes. Okay.
Looks like Mr. Francis does. Anybody else?
I keep hitting the wrong buttons.
Yep.
So basically, the premise behind a Four Corners activity is you just set up the four corners of your room when we are able to be in a room together, and you label each of the corners. One is strongly agree, another corner is agree, then you have disagree and strongly disagree, with the center of the room being kind of neutral stance, right? And the way the activity goes is that you present the class with a series of statements, and for each statement, they sort of move to the corner of the room that corresponds with their opinion on that particular statement. So since many of us are kind of working in a virtual mode right now and can't gather students in the same room, or even if we are in the same room, we can't have them huddle closely together in the corner. So we found kind of a way to adapt this for a virtual setting. And so I'm hoping to go through a few of the Four Corners statements that go along with this intro lesson with you all here today. Just as a reminder, as we're going through these Four Corners activities, whenever we're delving into these topics of, personal genetics, social implications of genetics, and just kind of those places where, genetics becomes very sensitive and personal to a person's life, we want to walk into those conversations with a bit of sensitivity, right? And so we always start by laying some ground rules, and we've done the same thing with our group here that is going through the Educator series. So we'll just start by reiterating kind of what the ground rules were, because ideally, as we do each of these Four Corners statements, we'll have people, we're going to use a poll to just quickly share our opinion or, move to our corner. But then after that, we like for people to kind of share their reasoning behind why they feel the way that they do. And there are no right or wrong answers to these things. There are no right or wrong opinions or feelings. There are very valid reasons why people may feel completely opposite from one another on a lot of these things, right? So basically, as we're going through this, I encourage you to try to listen to understand and not respond. Your focus should be on learning and not debating. Assume positive intent, realizing that intent can be different than impact. So, a lot of times people will say something, I've done it before, where whatever you say, it could be taken a couple of different ways, right? It could be taken in a respectful way, or it could be taken in a way that is less than respectful. So try to give people the benefit of the doubt and assume that they had positive intent, but also own the fact that your words may have an impact on someone that are different than what you intended for them to have. Speak from your own experience, not for large groups, you speak only for yourself. Critique ideas and not people. You don't have to agree with one another, but we do ask that you be civil, and it's okay to change your mind. We see that happen a lot. One of the things that happens when you're in a room doing the Four Corners is that you see people, as we ask one group to kind of explain why they feel the way they do about it, you'll see some people that are in another corner kind of start walking that direction, or they'll move to the center of the room that's sort of neutral or undecided, and that's fine. That's what we want. So much I feel like so much in our society right now is very polarized. We're moving to this place where we either feel strongly one way or strongly another way. And we aren't often the best at just being open to hearing another person's opinion or their thoughts on an issue or whatever. So I think this is great practice for students, regardless of what the topic is, to just be in a situation where you're going to hear different opinions and just listen respectfully. Yeah. All right, so this is the first of the statements that we're going to do related to the information from last week's lessons. Oh my goodness, my mouse. I want to find out my likelihood of developing a disease only if there are ways to prevent or treat it. I am trying to find, there we go, the poll. And I will launch this poll. Here we go. Now, I think everybody should be able to see the poll and be able to vote on it. So I want to be able to find out my likelihood of developing a disease only if there are ways to prevent or treat it. How do you feel about that statement?
So it looks like, if I can interject very quickly, we're still new to Zoom webinar. We've mainly used Zoom meeting format. And from what I can see, it looks like webinar only allows attendees to vote on polls. So now that we've made people panelists because, you know, we find it, like Rome was saying, it's so important to have these conversations. And that's a lot of what we do is we try and stimulate conversations. So we wanted to see you. But now that we've done this, I'm now seeing like it's only allowing 3 people to vote, which is exactly the number of. And I'm very glad that they're all voting, so we will get some results. But gosh, we're learning every day in these virtual things, I guess.
Yes,
So
everyone is learning. Okay, well, we will be adapting on the fly here, kind of going along with it. So I will ask that, you know, you will play along and participate here. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results of what we got from the 3 people who were able to vote. This mouse is not great. Okay, so of our N of 3 sample size here, 2 people disagreed with this and 1 person agreed. Can't easily know what actually the thoughts of the whole group were, but so for anybody who
Robin, just real quickly, there's Thomas came up with a good idea to share in a private chat what his thoughts were. That might be a way to get around it. So if
yeah, I mean, I'm perfectly fine with that. Or people want to, if you want to share it personally or, you know, privately or share it with the group, it's fine. Typically, you know, when we're in a real life situation in a classroom, it's not anonymous. You know, people actually move their body somewhere in the room and you can see where everybody stands. But the other thing that we do is often tell people, and sometimes we just say it at the beginning, and sometimes we'll get to a certain statement where pretty much everyone in the room moves to one corner, right? And so this isn't very interesting when we are in an echo chamber where everybody feels the same way. So we often ask somebody to play devil's advocate. And so you never really know, you know, people could be moving to corners that don't necessarily mean that they feel that way. Okay. Yeah, Thomas, did you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I was just going to say, I mean, we can actually put our answers to all panelists and attendees. Mine was just set to Rosemary, but I just changed it so that if we would like to put our answers in, it will go to all panelists and attendees.
That would be great. So if you choose to participate that way, in your chat box, the little blue thing where it says to, you can change it to all panelists and attendees, and we can try it that way. So, all right, we can see a couple of agrees, a couple of neutrals there. So, all right, so anybody who agrees or strongly agrees with this, would someone be interested or willing in sort of sharing their reasoning for feeling that way?
I will.
Okay.
Okay, I said agree. I think, of course, you know, to know about a disease that someone would have, and I will speak personally, I would definitely would like to know about it, especially if there is a cure for it, or preventative measures. However, I think even just knowing about it, I think will still be important, even if there's not a way to treat it or prevent it. I think it can still help with some life choices, you know, as it relates to family and friends and just, you know, how you live your life.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, I would still want to know.
So you might want to know not only if there was a treatment or cure, but potentially either way.
Exactly.
Right. Anybody else agree that they would only want to know if there was a treatment or a cure?
I also put agree. And Mostly because I just find myself to be the type of person that tends to not worry about things. And so if there was a way to prevent or treat it, then I would definitely want to know. But if there's nothing I can do about it, it just seems to me to be unnecessary worry or hardship, to be concerned about it if there's not going to be anything I can do about it anyway. But then I was just reading, Tiffany made a really good point in the chat, that if it's something that could impact future generations, that might sway me in a different way. But at the same time, if there's still not anything to do to prevent or treat it, that's just causing undue, unnecessary worry about my children or grandchildren, when there's nothing I can do about it too. So that's how I feel about it.
Okay, can we hear from some people who maybe disagree with this, or even if you don't personally disagree, can you think of what the arguments might be for someone who disagrees with the statement? Tiffany, yeah.
One person raising their hand. Do you have her? Okay.
I saw that Tiffany raised her hand, but
I'll allow her to talk. There we go.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I agree definitely with Carrie's point too. I think that I often err on the side of being an over worrier, and I could definitely see how that may even further a condition, just the stress it would bring me knowing. But originally I thought that if there were, like, say something, if I was predisposed to diabetes or something like that as an African-American woman, I would want my children's children to know, hey, this particular disease impacts our family and this is what you can do to prevent it. That was my thinking.
Awesome, yeah. And so these are a lot of the common kind of conversations that we hear is, people say, like, I would only want to know if there was a way to prevent or treat it because, I don't want to cause myself undue worry. For example, say, early onset Alzheimer's disease, right? Currently, there's no real treatment or cure for that. If you find out that you're genetically predisposed to that, then, every time you lose your glasses or your keys, you're wondering like, oh my gosh, is this the beginning of Alzheimer's versus just like, oh, I just lost my keys. It's not a big deal, right? But yeah, I mean, for people who have children or may want to have children, a lot of times that kind of shifts people's opinions of like, oh, I want to make sure that they know. The other thing with the speed of science and our knowledge changing, there may not be a way to prevent or treat it today, but who knows what it looks like a year, 2 or 5 or 10 from now. And so if you at least have the heads up that you have that increased likelihood, then maybe you're paying more attention, maybe you're going in for more frequent screenings, maybe you can participate in a clinical trial that helps develop that treatment or cure, right? So some different reasons you may want to. And again, there's no one right answer for everybody. All right, so how about this next one? And I think I'm just not going to bother with launching the poll since it doesn't get everybody anyway. So parents undergoing in vitro fertilization should have the option to screen embryos for mutations likely to cause a serious disease. So if parents are undergoing IVF, should they be able to screen embryos for mutations likely to cause a serious disease?
Tiffany, you have your hand raised again, or?
That is a hard question.
Thanks, we tried for that. So people want to put in the chat, like, you agree, strongly agree, neutral, if you choose to. Agree with reservations, agree. They should have an option. Agree involves a bigger question, agree, unsure. Okay, so we're leaning a little more toward one corner of the room here in this one. So let's first talk about reasons that people would agree with this statement. Anybody want to kind of speak for that stance?
I'm sorry, guys. I don't know how to raise my hand, so I'm just unmuting and speaking.
Go for it.
I said agree with reservations, and I lean towards agree because I feel like people who are in the position where they're using in vitro fertilization possibly and most often have been on a journey for a long time, and possibly and most likely have experienced tremendous loss in that journey to become parents. At least most of the people that I know that have used IVF, that's been their story. And so I think if you have the ability to screen the embryos, then you might be able to, save them from additional hardship if it's not a viable embryo. But, then there's this whole other conversation about, like ethics, like Dr. Rana was saying. So I lean towards yes, agree, but knowing that, so many people who have suffered with fertility issues and gone through all of those losses. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I don't know. I'm on the fence about it. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. IVF is not typically people's first swing at conceiving, right? I mean, it usually comes at the end of a long journey. Other reasons? Yeah, Dr. Rana?
So I was just going to say that I do agree with it. And yes, it does involve the ethics question, but these days, cord screen and all of this is part of your regular pregnancy checkup. So we are going to find out, like, even if it's a normal pregnancy, you do have these options where if there's a serious disorder these days, you're screened for it. I think it's in the first trimester. So you do get to know it. I think the bigger question is that sometimes those results are questionable. And then I have 2 kids myself, and then they leave it to you that, okay, this might be a false positive. Would you be interested in doing amniocentesis and finding out more, or, just so I definitely agree with it because, and I do see the point that, people who go for in vitro fertilization have been trying to have a kid for a long time. There are a lot of sentiments and emotions involved there. But then having a child with a serious disease, and serious in what terms, like fatal, non-fatal, there's again a lot of trauma involved in that too. So if I have to put all of those things together and coming from the side of science, I would like to know, I would like to have the option to get the screen done and know that I'm going to have a healthy child.
Right. Yeah. Any other people who want to speak on the agree side before we go to disagree?
Yeah, I was going to say that if you're in a position to know ahead of time, and I think this process gives you that option where you can know ahead of time. But my question is for the ones that where there is a serious disease, where they find out there is a serious disease, what happens with those? I don't know what you call them.
Those embryos?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
what happens?
I think the idea would be that those embryos would not be implanted and would likely be discarded, right? And so this particular question or statement, well, I guess before we go into that, does anybody want to talk about the disagree side of this? Why a person may disagree with this particular statement? Even if it's not your own personal opinion, can you imagine the argument that may be made or the reasoning behind someone saying, no, I don't agree with this?
Go ahead, Tiffany. I see your hands raised.
The point that Dr. Rana made a little while ago, I think really hit home for me with my second child, who's 13 now. In my first trimester, I did take a test and the test result was that I could possibly be a carrier for Down syndrome. And so I went through different other tests. And as a result, just it was determined that he probably did not have it, things like that. But I think that maybe it was very, very early in my pregnancy. But for that entire 9 months, the amount of stress that I felt was extremely significant. So much so that when I actually delivered, was terrified to look because I just didn't know what the future would bring us. Now, he does not have Down syndrome and is the light of my life, but he would have also been the light of my life otherwise. But just listening to that perspective and having lived it, I can see how a disagree or agree would simply be a personal stance, like for every individual to have the opportunity to make.
Yeah. So I would say the thing that we hear brought up a lot of times, for some people, when we bring up this statement, like they're done, and as soon as we say IVF, they're like their personal, often religious beliefs are just opposed to IVF, right? But what is often very interesting with this statement is that we frequently find ourselves in a room, depending on if we're with adults or if we're with, school-aged kids. But especially we do a lot of education with teachers, and you'll have a teacher in there who expresses, that that's their personally held beliefs that, life begins at conception. And so, from the point that you make an embryo, then, that's a child. And then you'll also have people in the room who will say, well, if it wasn't for IVF, I wouldn't have my children, so you can just tell that like both of those people have really strong beliefs and really strong feelings about this statement in the same room. And I often feel like it's kind of often a powerful moment that happens in the workshops when you hear people like sharing their reasons for feeling the different ways about this. And I also, I think as you brought up about getting screenings that happen like during the first trimester, for some people, you may really prefer to find things out before implanting an embryo versus waiting until you've already established a pregnancy, right? And finding things out during the first trimester. But yeah, again, there's no like right or wrong opinions here, and people feel different ways about it. So let's take this.
And I think if I can interject
definitely.
I think also for this statement, especially when you're talking with students who might be a bit more removed from the idea of them being pregnant themselves. Although, like we mentioned before, 16-year-olds can be closer to that than we might sometimes want to think they are. So in that sense, that's also why, because sometimes I've met teachers who are like, oh, I'm not sure this is a topic I want to be talking with my students with. And I'm like, I fully hear that. It's definitely a challenging topic, but at the same time, I've always felt, as somebody who's trained in genetics, very fortunate that if I go into a doctor's office, I kind of know what to ask for and I kind of know what to expect almost. And I feel that if you, like Dr. Rana also mentioned, like testing has become almost, I'm not sure we're fully there, but it's almost kind of a part of being pregnant is that you're going to have genetic tests. And I think I would rather have that information before I go in than that being thrown on me with my pregnancy hormones as I'm sitting in a doctor's office to then make a decision. And another thing I want to highlight, which was also kind of pointed out, is the word serious in this sentence is something that very often when I do this with students, that's kind of where the conversation goes, is what do we mean by serious? And where do we draw the line of what is serious and what is not serious? It's a very interesting conversation because that's also not an easy thing to do, right? And on top of that, I think it's also to keep in mind as an educator when you're doing this about that just because you find out an embryo is a serious disease, whether it is in the IVF stage or early trimester, sometimes students have the tendency to immediately jump to like, oh, then we're either not going to implant, or even with somebody who's already pregnant, maybe termination would be an option, when actually there are quite a few people who do the screening because they want to know so they can prepare. It's not about a termination decision. It's about, I want to know that, for example, my child's going to have a certain condition, so I make sure that the right doctors are there when I'm giving birth and can make sure that that initial care is there. So that's sometimes important to kind of highlight to students that this is not just about, once you have that information of whatever serious disease is, termination is the only kind of reason people do this or want to know that information.
Yeah, definitely good points. And the conversation about seriousness, things like Tay-Sachs disease comes up, like if you're talking about something that is early onset and very life limiting, right, with a lot of suffering, versus like Huntington's disease. Well, I mean, I think people would argue that Huntington's disease is also very serious, but it has much later onset, right? It doesn't onset until you're in your 40s, maybe later. And who knows? I mean, if you're talking about an embryo now and a disease that likely won't start to have onset for 40 years, I mean, science is going to advance a lot, at least hopefully, in the next 40 years. So maybe by the time that person would start to feel the effects of having Huntington's disease, it would be a non-issue because we had developed a treatment or cure. So there's just not any way to know that. So let's take this a step further and say, how about parents should be able to choose a child's traits such as eye color and sex for non-medical reasons. So we're not talking about, choosing sex to avoid like a known sex-linked disorder that they carry genes for, but just for parental preference reasons. People want to put in the chat whether you, how you feel about this, agree, disagree. I see a lot of disagrees coming up. Disagrees, strongly disagrees. All right, somebody want to talk about why they disagree or strongly disagree here?
So I am originally from India, and for years, I was a child. I remember my country has been plagued with female infanticide. I don't know if you're aware or not, but we have had the practice that, somehow boys are preferred. There's a huge especially among the people who are not as educated, and a lot of India resides in villages, and we do not, they don't always have access to education and information and all of this. So there was this huge practice that, people were going for their regular, pregnancy screen sonography, and if it's a female child, they do not want it, they would abort it. So for us, a law was made years ago. I was only a child that, when we go for regular pregnancy checkup visits, the doctors or the technicians or the nurses are not allowed, even to this day, to tell you the sex of the baby, because female infanticide was a real problem in India. And at one point, for every 1,000 boys, we only had like 600 something girls. So coming from that background, I know what this could do in with mentality like this. So I just very strongly disagree with this.
Good point. I saw a documentary several years ago at this point, but it was called It's a Girl. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it specifically talks about the issue of infanticide in several different cultures. And India was one of the locations they went. I think they went 2 other places and just told the story. And that was like one of the most gut-wrenching documentaries that I've ever watched. It was terrible. Anyone else want to talk about why they disagree with this? Okay, who wants to play devil's advocate and talk about why someone might agree and think, yeah, parents should be able to do this?
I guess I think you would be coming from a huge place of privilege to be able to do that. I don't, at this point especially, but even if the technology, and the advancements were there in the future to make it easily accessible, I feel like it still seems like something that would be for the privileged population. And so, then you get into all those questions about eugenics and When you think about even people who have issues with, like interracial parentage, even getting into those conversations, it just opens a whole, Pandora's box of of things that could go wrong. And then I mentioned in the this kind of gets back to more of like the genetic disorders and not so much the choice, but the story in the full documentary of the woman with achondroplasia, and she was concerned about people like her not existing anymore. Yeah. And so when I was thinking about this question, I kind of had her thoughts in the back of my mind as far as like, if you were a person who was incredibly proud of, your heritage and all of the traits that came along with that, and then people started electing to phase those out, with these kinds of choices, then you get into that where there are no longer people that look like me. And there's, maybe there's some stigma behind, if you choose to have brown eyes instead of blue, or, that kind of thing. So I don't know, I think it just has a whole host of issues.
Yeah, definitely. She was kind of funny, right, on the movie, because I think she had 1 or 2 children that also had achondroplasia, and then she got pregnant with an average height child. And she said when she first saw the ultrasounds, right, she was like, why does this child have such long arms and legs, right? Because she had just been so used to seeing, herself and her children that had achondroplasia with their shorter limbs. This conversation comes up a lot, and often with deafness as well. Deafness is one of those traits that a lot of people may see as a disability, but if you talk to people who are deaf, they don't necessarily see it that way. There's a very strong sense of community, and there's deaf culture, and people who have deafness don't necessarily see it as any sort of deficit. It's just it's a difference. It's who they are. And there are conversations swirling right now. There's a doctor from Russia, I believe. I think his name's Rubikov or something like that. He's wanting to use CRISPR genome editing to edit embryos of parents who both have a genetic form of deafness, so that they would give birth to a hearing child. But we also sometimes have the conversation of, what if you had deaf parents who specifically wanted to select to have a deaf child? And is that a reasonable thing to do, right? Sometimes I feel like more frequently when you have these questions, we're talking about, like, is it ethical to choose, for an embryo that maybe doesn't have something that we may see as an illness or a disability or a disease or whatever, but then is it also ethical to specifically choose for a person to have something that others may conceive of as a disability? So, that's interesting questions there.
I think,
Go ahead.
To play I'm not sure that's the devil's advocate here, but there are clearly people agreeing to this statement, at least in the United States. So this was surprising for me coming from Europe, or specifically the Netherlands is what I should be talking about because that's my home country. So you can screen and know the gender or the sex of your baby, but what is not allowed in the Netherlands is to select for sex unless there is a medical reason to do so. However, in the US, you are allowed to do that. The US allows you to select for sex. It's in the realm of, I think they call it family balancing. Family balancing. The idea of, like, I've had 3 sons, I really want a daughter now. That's kind of where it is allowed if you wanted to go through IVF and select an embryo based on sex, even though there's no medical reason there.
Another, and this is a out there devil's advocate kind of argument, but Dr. Rana was talking about, infanticide. So some people could argue, well, this is a way to reduce infanticide if we could choose the sex beforehand. I'm not arguing that that's a correct way to go about it, but some people may say, like, let's just choose ahead of time. Other people, you know, when we hear arguments in our discussions for this, and people say, you know, like, I want to give my child whatever sorts of benefits I can possibly give them. So if I know that, you know, by me choosing for them to be whatever it is, you know, whether it's being male, whether, you know, we find genes that are going to make you bigger, faster, and stronger, and, you know, have goals of like having this, you know, remember this athlete or what, you know, like, I would want to do that if I had the means to do it, you know. But then, like, this week, we're going to encourage you to watch the lessons on eugenics, right, and on CRISPR. And so I think it's a very slippery slope when we start deciding like what traits we're going to choose and putting value statements on certain traits, you know, being more preferable than others and that sort of thing. Like where do we run into, you know, getting it back into like a eugenics type of situation. All right, let me do one more statement here before we move on. How's this one? I would want to know if someone I was dating had a strong genetic predisposition to a serious disease. This is always a really fun one to do with high school kids, I'll tell you that. Very lively discussions ensue. So I see a couple of agrees, one dating, maybe not, marrying, yes. Okay, somebody who says, yeah, you want to know if someone you were dating had a strong genetic predisposition. Want to talk about why you agree with this one? Anyone?
I think everyone can elect to speak if you want to. Tiffany, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
So at my age, if I were dating, I would imagine my hope or intent would be to marry. So before I went too far along, I just would like to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I said agree because I think of things like sickle cell or cystic fibrosis, where you really have to consider, like, if you want to have children in the future, about your child and getting that disease, especially if you're a carrier. And so I think of like my family member who is a carrier, and how that decision could be the difference between their child getting sickle cell or not. So it's very, such a hard question, because like, of course you don't want that to be the reason why you know, stop, like, you're not continuing to date them anymore, even if you like them or not. But it is something that you always have to have in the back of your mind.
Right. I see a few neutrals on there. People want to say why you're neutral. What leaves you conflicted here?
I think we already have like some practices in place, and I didn't realize all of that until I started going into the field of genetics, like, you know, marriage between first cousins, marrying outside of your community and things like that to, you know, stop the spread of, you know, recessive disorders basically within the same family and all of that. But this is a hard question. Like, what do you do? Like, do you do a genetic screen before you're marrying someone or you're dating someone? Like, that is not where we are right now. But I mean, my parents, I mean, they don't realize it now. Both of my parents are Rh negative. My mother and my father, they're both B negative blood group. I'm a B negative blood group. My husband is not, and we know we have a ROGAM shot now. But, and they didn't like check their blood groups to get married, but luckily they did not have that issue. But I'm thinking in the olden times, maybe that was an issue when we didn't have those shots and everything. So there are so many sides to this question that like Ky'Era said, that if it is a serious disease and you want to have children in future and all of that, as somebody who knows, I mean, if you don't understand it, you don't understand it. But if you understand it, like if Ky'Era goes and dates someone, I'm just going to use that example, because she knows so much, it becomes a whole another perspective versus somebody who doesn't know so much about genetics and doesn't care for it. So I think that's where it gets really neutral for me.
Yeah. Bridget, I think I saw you unmute for a second too. Did you have something to share?
I did, yeah. I would say that, I think, wouldn't you be limiting yourself to having maybe a wonderful relationship for, 5 or 10 years, even though someone had some, genetic predisposition to a serious disease. And so you just sort of not allowed yourself to be in a relationship with someone because they have this. You don't know what's going to happen. You might learn something about yourself or the other person, or, having to go through that disease. And I think, for me, it would always be in the back of my mind, like, oh, is this the time? I don't think I want to know that part of the future. I think it's like when things come up, you just handle it. We don't know when a tornado or hurricane or something comes through. We just handle it, and it makes us stronger. So I think sort of knowing it would sort of be always in the back of my mind, and I think it wouldn't allow me to have a relationship with someone that might be terrific for 5 years, because I'm sort of afraid of what might happen to that person.
Yeah, true.
That's actually a point of view that I wasn't thinking about. I was thinking more of like they might pass it on to our children if we chose to have them. So that kind of got me thinking too, like that puts me even more on the fence, because I wouldn't want to miss out on, potentially years of happiness if it was something that they were actually, going to have, like Huntington's or something that would develop later. I was thinking of it more in terms of passing it on to children. And even then I'm still conflicted, because you have other options as far as, if you knew, you could choose to use a donor, or, do if the testing was available. But at the same time, I sort of go back to that first question about is there any way to treat it, or a cure for it? And, you kind of, I just don't know. I don't know that I would want to know. And I don't know if I knew if it would make a difference.
Yep.
And I certainly didn't know any kind of information at all about my husband's genetic background. Unfortunately we ended up with a perfect child, but in our eyes, but it's one of those things. I just don't know. I can't make a decision one way or the other, because I don't know that it would make a difference.
Yeah. What about anybody who disagrees, or somebody who could think of why somebody might disagree? Or Thomas, it looks like you unmuted, so maybe you have something to add just to the neutral stance. Or...
Yes, I was just going to say, do we begin to create a population that's disregarded in that aspect?
Yeah.
Do they begin to feel rejected by society and by people?
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I wondered about in terms of building off of what Thomas just mentioned. Like, I'm sure that there are groups, maybe of indigenous groups, who have been, moved or displaced. And I wonder how genetics might play a role in terms of, being able to save a certain population of people as well. Also thinking about that and wondering, does that play a role?
Yeah. It's like I said, it's very interesting having this conversation with high school students, because I guess at first I thought a lot of people would be like, yeah, I'd want to know. And, like I wouldn't want to date somebody if they had a predisposition. But, what I find more often than not is you have a lot of students in the class that if they say they would want to know, We always also have the conversation of like, when is that appropriate to know? Like, is that part of your, online dating profile, or is that like a first date conversation, or how far down the road do you go? Because there's like, private and personal information is probably not something you're going to talk about right away. But then like, if you are going to divulge it, but you don't until things get super, super serious, then it, like a person may wish they knew sooner. But a lot of times actually the high school students will say, well, it wouldn't make me not want to date them or not have a relationship with them. If I care about someone, love them, like them, love them, whatever, like, it wouldn't change that. I would just like to know so that I could be prepared, or that we can make informed decisions if we thought about having children together and that sort of thing. So that always sort of gives me hope for the future, when you hear like these young people that are just being very, empathetic and compassionate and just like, well, I would want to know, but just to make informed decisions kind of thing, so can be interesting. All right, I think that's the last four corners question I have. Does anybody have like any parting thoughts that they want to share before we move on to sort of the next part of things here? Do you think these conversations would work well with your students in your classrooms or get them interested? We tend to find that these sort of bring genetics to life. For me, I loved science. I loved school. All the subjects were my favorite subject, except for history. But, like, it didn't take much to motivate me to like be jazzed about going to school, but not all kids are like that. Some people like walk into science class and they're like, whatever. But I think even just like starting a class with one of these questions where you're like, okay, let's talk about this, kind of controversial topic. Let's hear your opinions. Like, students want to tell you what they think about things, right? And like, just have that ability of somebody to care what they think, and not just like a right and wrong answer on a test sort of thing, but like dig deep and like think about these things or whatever. So yeah, they tend to make things pretty interesting.
Yeah, my question would be, giving it to middle schoolers, I'm just kind of thinking, would I have to provide more information up front? Could I just give it to them the way it is? And, or, will there have to be a lot of explaining in one direction or not? So that's
Right.
what I'm kind of thinking about.
Yeah, I'll say most of the time when we're writing our lessons, we have high schoolers in mind in terms of like trying to write at a level that we feel like high schoolers could handle. Some of our lessons are definitely easily appropriate for middle school audiences, and other ones are a little, maybe advanced for average middle schoolers. There are easy ways, I think, to adapt some of these and change them, to subjects that are maybe more relatable. And it also just depends on like where they are in their understanding of genetics. Like, what does genetics mean? How definite is genetic? Like if you have a gene, does it definitely mean you're going to have a certain thing, or like all that sort of thing? Nadine, was there something you were going to say? I feel like.
Yeah, so from my own experience, I've done these with middle schoolers. The conversation looks a little different because obviously they are at a very different stage in their lives. They won't be I might not have included necessarily the IVF one. We have a couple more, I think, in our lesson itself. But like this one on dating, for example, to use it as an example, like predisposition, I probably have to explain what that means, although I've also had to explain that with high schoolers as well as adults. It's a word that for me is very familiar as a geneticist, but it's not necessarily, I would say, a well-known term. I think the conversation changes in the sense that students might react. I want them to be able to react without me first having to explain things, because I think it helps active learning a lot. So for example, students might say, they might start talking about coronavirus, and it's a great moment to then talk about like, well, actually that's also a disease, but it's not a genetic disease, because, and then you can kind of go into explaining concepts. So you'll definitely be, I think, at least from my experience, you're doing more explaining because students have some misconceptions, or they might ask you. I've had students ask me like, what do you mean by serious? Which is a wonderful question, because that's exactly what we're trying to get at. Like, that's the question, right? So it's a different approach, but it's definitely doable, at least from my experience.
Mm-hmm. I've had the same thing come up, but with HIV. And it ended up kind of having to take like a detour and have like a good conversation about HIV, and that is not a genetic disease. And like, it took a while to kind of sort that out of like what the difference was and like how do you get HIV versus how do you, how are genetic diseases passed on and that sort of thing. So yeah, it does happen.
I will briefly share too. It's not pgEd written, but there is an animated series available in that same gene collection on the PBS Learning Media that you guys might want to check out as well as part as your in-depth research with the pgEd team as extra resources.
Yes, definitely. Oh, right. So as we've seen, when we're talking about genetics, it can bring up a whole lot of difficult questions. Some of these we've talked about and some we haven't. So, am I at risk of developing a genetic disease? What do I want to know? Do I want to do a DNA ancestry test? And what if I receive surprising results? We get questions sometimes from teachers who want to do DNA ancestry testing with their classes. But that's something to really think through. I know some DNA ancestry testing companies specifically say that their tests are not meant to be used by minors. But there's issues there, right, of informed consent and privacy. And sometimes people get surprising results from an ancestry test, right? And sometimes those are exciting, happy, surprising results. And sometimes those are painful, surprising results that, change what you feel about yourself or what you know about your identity and your family history, and that sort of thing. So, if you were to do, and I don't think necessarily that middle school, high school teachers should do it, but we do know of some like college professors that will do this with college classes where they can do ancestry testing and explore their results together. You have to be really prepared that people may be dealing with some heavy stuff when they get those results that they weren't really expecting to confront. Like if I upload my genetic data to a genealogy database, will my information remain private? With the advent of these direct-to-consumer DNA ancestry tests, like a lot of people are like excited about that. They're getting the test done, and then you can upload your data to these third-party databases. But you have to be sure you're reading the fine print of like what that means for the privacy of your information and that sort of thing. On one hand, it's done wonders for people who are genealogy enthusiasts and really want to like find long lost distant relatives and that sort of thing. But other people have been surprised to find that, their genetic information was used by law enforcement in searches for suspects and that sort of thing. If I find out information about my DNA, will it have negative consequences for me in terms of healthcare or insurance? If I have increased likelihood of developing serious disease, should I disclose that to someone I'm dating, which we kind of just talked about? And if the tables were returned, would I want to know? If I learned that I carry genes that predispose me to a genetic disease, should I tell my family, right? So, maybe you're curious to find out about your genetic makeup, but maybe your biological relatives don't necessarily want to know. Like, what if you find out that, you carry a version of BRCA1 or 2 that puts you at elevated risk for breast cancer, for example, breast and ovarian cancer? Would you feel like you should let your biological relatives know that and encourage them to get screening? What if they've specifically told you already that they wouldn't want to know that, but you get information that could help them make health-related decisions, that can put you in a weird ethical quandary. If I'm asked by law enforcement to provide a DNA sample, do I have to comply? What happens to that sample once they have it? What database is it going into? How long can they keep it? Are there ways in which I can get that DNA removed from the database? And are the results of genetic research applicable to me and people who share my ancestry? We have a lot of problems right now that, a lot of the medical research that's been done has been done on people of European descent, right? And so there's a big push now to try to diversify the pool of people that that research is done on, because we just don't know if the results are broadly applicable to everyone, if everyone has not been included in the research. So all these kind of difficult questions that come up, and many, many more. There's just so many ways that when we start talking about genetics, it can get really personal in a whole lot of different ways. So one of the things that we often do is kind of pair this with a conversation about how to have these difficult conversations. It's one of the most common things that we hear from teachers who, see pgEd lessons and that kind of stuff. They're like, it's really cool, engaging stuff, whatever, but I just don't know that I feel comfortable bringing this into my classroom and like starting these potentially, controversial discussions with my students, and like, how do I make sure it doesn't go off the rails? And, what do I do if a student in my class divulges some really personal, private information and, all that sort of thing. So we have a colleague, Allison Werner-Lynn, who is a professor at Penn, who is just an amazing, amazing woman and so much fun to listen to. If you ever have a chance to listen to her present, it's a good time. And we sometimes have her come in with our professional development workshops and that kind of stuff, and do a presentation about having difficult conversations with young people. She's a social worker, and her area of expertise, she deals a lot with young people who have familial cancers in their family. So a lot of the people she works with are young people who have maybe just lost a parent to like a familial cancer, or have a parent who is dying of a familial cancer, and talks to them about, what that means for them, just through that whole process. So she's very well versed in having very difficult genetics related conversations with adolescents. And so she's put together kind of a presentation that gives teachers some tips for like, how do you have these difficult conversations? And so I've pulled a lot from her presentation. She's given us permission to use her stuff, but I just wanted to give her full credit because I did not create this stuff. So if you start, just kind of think about the most challenging questions that you've ever been asked by a student. And I don't know if anybody will have any they want to share, but with a difficult conversation, like, was it a public or a private conversation? What was difficult about it? How did you feel when the exchange ended? And how might the social context and history have shaped the question and your answer? Give you kind of a second to think about that. Anybody have anything that kind of came to mind right away?
There was a couple of examples that I thought of. The one that always gets me is when students ask if I believe in God, because that's not something that is supposed to be discussed at school, and not something that I'm comfortable discussing. And then the other really challenging, not challenging for me personally, but challenging with not knowing how to respond, was like in 2016 around the election of Donald Trump. And I work with a very high immigrant population, and they, there was a lot of concern over, like the ending of DACA and things like that early on, that they were asking questions about that were completely unrelated to, the topics we were discussing in class, but completely related to their experiences in life. And so those were really challenging questions, where I don't know that it's just not something that I didn't know how to answer, because I didn't feel like it was my place to give them any kind of opinion on the matter. And I wasn't versed enough in the topic to be able to give them factual information without expressing opinion. And so that's what made it challenging for me.
Yeah. I got goosebumps when you were talking about some of that, actually, and that's the thing. And you hit on several of the points that are coming up in the presentation, of like just recognizing the context within which these students are coming to you, right? I mean, whatever it is you teach, biology, science, whatever, like, yes, that's your field of expertise, but these kids are walking in the door with a whole life, that they're bringing with them, and things that are happening outside of that classroom are very, very relevant to what's happening inside of it. And how are you even supposed to focus on biology if you're worried about whether or not you're going to be deported, right? Or if someone in your family is, or whatever. So yeah, those are tough. Anyone else had something that they want to share that was difficult?
So I can't think of like questions exactly because most of my students are adults. They're definitely all 21 and above. But sometimes what concerns me is, and this is to your question number 3, I mean, how I feel after the exchange ends, that, I mean, I'm left wondering that if the question was even addressed, because when conversation I've found becomes sensitive and personal, it just follows a new direction. And personally, I'm often left wondering that if I addressed it, did I make it worse? I mean, what is the student going to go home and maybe talk to the roommate or the sibling, what they're going to say? And I often find it awkward to follow up on it because it's, if they come to you just saying that, I'm not doing so well in the class as well as I expected, you can follow up on that and, talk to them 2 weeks later and see how they feel about it now or what have they changed and everything. But this is the kind of conversation that you cannot, like, even if you want to, just out of concern, want to see where they landed after it. It is very awkward, and especially dealing with adult students, you feel like you're not respecting their privacy enough, or you're encroaching a boundary, or how far can you go? That just, it always leaves me feeling at that point. I'm always there when these conversations happen, that did we address it enough? Did it even do anything? Or did we make it worse? And that's the one that gets me the most.
Yeah, and it can be difficult to know, right? And I think, though, in terms of following up, I mean, if they came to you with the question, then there's a certain amount of openness to talking to you about it. So I don't know if maybe there's a way to open the door to them coming back to follow up if they want, without it coming across like you're prying for more information or invading their privacy anyway. But I totally understand that kind of thing. All right, so again, this is more Allison's kind of presentation, but about talking about personal genetics in high school. And, when we're having kind of the context of having these conversations, think about, for the students that are there, schools are a place where they have safety, right? Schools provide structure, routine, ritual. It's a normative setting for them to be away from home. They're separated from their family, right? And it's a normal place for them to kind of get that experience of being away from their family. School life is supporting mastery across different domains. So not only like the academic stuff, right? I mean, that's important, but we know students are also just learning like how to behave, like how to have social interaction, social comparison and learning. Schools are places where children are expected to learn about the world in general. So not just the specific subject matter, but just the world and how it works. Outside of classroom instruction, the teacher's role is to restore or enhance teens' ability to learn. And then school supports validation and normalization. So peers provide an essential other outside of their family context, right? So it's another place for you just to kind of learn like who you are in the world and how to function in the world. And teachers provide knowledge, right? So what's interesting about a lot of these lessons is that like this curriculum, it's about them. When we're talking about personal genetics, right? We're talking about why this matters to you, or why it should matter to you, or how it could become very personal to you. Your job is to teach them ways to think about the world, the scientific world, not telling them what to think, but teaching them how to examine things, right? They think you probably know more than you let on in class. There's safety in the scientific method, and fact-finding is less scary than existential angst of being a teenager, right? And you're the expert in the room. So now what, right? These students come to you with questions, and now what are you going to do? As we talked about a little bit ago, there's this whole context within which these students are coming to you. Think of where they are cognitively, right? This is kind of the beginning of where they're having conceptual and abstract thought, right? In terms of identity, they're wrestling with their understanding of their self in relation to others. They're also, their identity as a member of their cohort, of their peers, as well as like their historical lineage in their family, and what their identity is in terms of like their lineage and where they came from. Morally, adolescents are starting, they're understanding random versus planned events and the recognition of injustice, so a lot of these topics that we talk about, they talk about social justice or injustice, equity, or places where there's lack of equity and that sort of thing. And students are at a place where they can have those kind of conversations. Emotionally, ability to handle complex relationships and navigate complex situations. And then physically, just a recognition that the body is dynamic and limited, right? Obviously adolescence is a place where you learn a whole lot about the body and it not being this static thing, right? It is definitely changing daily. So you have to kind of think of, all of those contexts within the students are coming to you. So when these conversations come up, whether it's, personal genetics, personal things in general with the students, kind of her suggestions are, first of all, to just normalize and validate the worth of that adolescent or that student. So, if they come to you, they're concerned about something, normalize it. Lots of teens feel like you do when blah, 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 blah. They get this certain news or they find out whatever about their family or they get information about their genetic makeup, whatever it might be. Commend their courage. So if they're coming to you with these difficult questions, these are hard questions, and it's reasonable and understandable that you're, struggling through them and don't necessarily know what the right answer for you is. Provide detailed information or find out and follow up. We all know students come to us with questions that we're not always prepared for, right? When they stick to the subject matter, that's the easy stuff. But oftentimes they may ask you things that are a little bit out of your comfort zone. And so if you have the information to give it to them. Otherwise, buy some time. Just say, why don't we talk again after I have some time to learn about that? Because I don't know the answer for you right now, but, let me find out more. Make room for normative volatility. So, if they're dealing with something, you're feeling a lot of different things right now, and those feelings might change. Just to let them know that whatever strong feelings that they're having right now, those are valid feelings to have. You might be having more than one feeling at the same time, and you may feel different right now than you did yesterday, and you might feel different tomorrow, and that's okay. Be prepared for that. And then accept and identify ambivalence about genetics. So there are no right answers to many of the questions, and it's okay to be confused. It's okay to not know. It's okay to be the kid who's standing in the center of the room on neutral for all of the four corners activities, it's okay to not know. So a few steps for responding to questions that the students might ask, or comments they might make. So validate, so tell them that you understand their need for information. Normalize, explain that asking questions and seeking help are common and expected. Seek clarification about the nature of the student's question. Sometimes the question that the student asks isn't necessarily the thing they want to know. There's something deeper behind there that they're actually trying to find out about themselves, about their family, about the world, right? So sometimes it takes a couple of follow-up questions to kind of find out what is the heart of this. What are you really worried about? What are you really wondering about? What are you trying to figure out here? Identify the bounds of your role and comfort, right? So was that Carrie who was kind of talking about that, of what's my role? What am I here to talk about? It's not my place to really talk about religion and that sort of thing, right? What do I feel comfortable talking about, and where is there sort of a boundary of I understand that that's a really important question for you or whatever, and maybe it would be better if you talk to the guidance counselor about that, or maybe that's a great question, but it's probably more appropriate to ask your doctor or a genetic counselor or whoever it might be, right? So just kind of understanding, and this kind of takes some thought ahead of time of where are your boundaries? What are you willing to talk about with students, and what are you not willing to talk about? And some of that can be just boundaries about stories about your own personal experience and personal life, right? But then also provide resources, if you're not the right person to ask, let them know where they can find those answers. All right, so we have a little practice example here of a student. Let's imagine the student comes to you and says, wants to meet with you after school to review assignment. And when you sit down, he says, my parents said they're taking me to the hospital today to do a test about my brother's heart. They want to test my blood to see if I have the heart problem too. If I do have it, they won't let me play soccer anymore. Can I decide not to give blood for a genetic test? Right? So here's a student who's worried about having this genetic test done, right? It's becoming personal. You know, their brother has some sort of issue, and their parents want to know if they also have it. So does anybody want to, looking at our steps here again, anybody want to take a shot of like, what might you say? Like, what does it sound like to respond to Pat here? How do you go through these steps of validating and normalizing and all that stuff? What's that sound like? Anybody want to give it a shot? What's validation sound like? Validating their need for information.
I think Tiffany has a raised hand.
Okay, yeah, I can't see that.
I think you made an important point earlier about this type of question would, in my mind, be an opportunity for you to say, I really need more time to think about that, because to me, the student is asking several layers of a question, and definitely the parental aspect of it is what you would need to honor first as an educator. So I do think that would be one of the questions that you would want to defer to having an opportunity to respond to later.
Yeah, it would be nice, but parents are taking them to the hospital today.
Yeah, so I think I would say yes. I think I'll say wow. That's a really challenging situation to be in. We understand that you have a passion and a love for soccer, and so we can understand why you would be concerned about that. However, though, I can't necessarily make a decision or give you my opinion too much, because this is a decision by your parents. And I just hope for the best for you, and that you will be able to still continue to play soccer. Let me know what happens.
Yeah, and I think that was great, right? You're validating that, like, oh yeah, like I understand why that's a big deal, why that's important to you, and why it's stressful for you, and that sort of thing. Yeah, and it's normal to want to talk to somebody about it. You could seek some clarification, right? So maybe it's like, asking for clarification about, like, are you sure, like, if depending on the results of this test would determine whether or not you're able to play soccer. Sometimes you may find that students maybe don't have a clear understanding of it, or maybe they've kind of extrapolated a few steps down the road of what it's going to mean. We know that a lot of students have this like genetic deterministic view, right? And oftentimes the way genetics is taught with Mendelian genetics and stuff, it's easy for people to get this idea of this, like, you have this gene, you have this trait, that sort of thing, that there's this one-to-one correlation between a gene and an outcome. So sometimes there might be able to clarify some information there. Again, identifying the balance of your role, which, Tiffany was really good about that. Like, I'm your teacher, so you can be supportive. And as Thomas said, like, I hope for the best for you. I hope it all works out well for you and that you're able to continue to play soccer and that sort of stuff. But I'm not necessarily the best person to ask. I can't tell you what to do. I can't even give you advice necessarily or tell you what I would do. But again, provide resources. So maybe there's a school counselor that, it could be helpful just to talk through your feelings with, or, seeing your physician or genetic counselor or whatever.
At
but
14,
these kind of conversations, yeah.
Sorry, at 14, I think providing resources part, I think it would also be appropriate to tell the student that they could you know, maybe you can ask to speak with the doctor privately, you know, so that they could ask the questions that they have and express the concerns that they have without feeling like they're, you know, disappointing their parents or they're going against what their parents have said needs to be done.
Right.
You know, as the teacher, I don't necessarily have the answer to that question if they can decide to not give the blood or not. But I can certainly tell them that they, you know, should talk to the doctor about it, or, you know, they can ask to talk to the doctor about it privately.
Yeah, and just asking the doctor to explain it better, you know, like why might that mean that you can't play soccer, or what risks would it bring if you did find out that you had the same condition that your brother has, and you decided to continue playing soccer? Like, what risks are you taking on? Why might you decide that it's not in your best interest to continue playing versus to take the risk to continue, you know, like sometimes just understanding the connection a little better. So that's just kind of one example. You know, Allison usually does more, but she usually has more time to go through. Oh shoot, we're already over time. Goodness, let me hurry up and finish here. So basically, when we're thinking about you know, students' needs, think about they're negotiating peer pressure to conform. So thinking about how their genome might distinguish them from their peers, or how it connects them to their peers. You know, they're all about comparison and what makes me fit in, what makes me different. Increased capacity for self-management and care. So how can I stay healthy and fit now? Students oftentimes are very in the here and now. So what can I do now? What does this mean for me right now? You know, what does this mean for this soccer season, right? That's where Pat is, this 14-year-old, like right now. Evolving philosophy of life. Oops. So what does genomics suggest about the course and content of my life? You know, what does this mean going forward? Moral and spiritual identity. So who do I want to be? Acknowledgement of fear and grief. What feelings does genetic information arouse in me? And distinguishing important urgent decisions. Like, what do I have to consider now and what can wait? Right. So right now it might be about soccer participation. Questions that can wait might be about treatments down the line, might be, you know, questions about having kids and that sort of thing later. All right, so quickly got through that. That was kind of the end. If anyone has comments and questions, I'm happy to take those. I do want to wrap up for, you know, people that need to go and that sort of thing. But I did just want to say, for those that are following along for like the third week of this series, what I'm hoping people will do in preparation for next week would be to watch the lessons on the history of eugenics on the PBS Learning Media website. So there's 2 units there. There's one on eugenics, and then there's one on using primary sources to talk about the history of eugenics. So looking at like actual documents from the time when the American eugenics movement was going on. And then watch the lesson on genome editing and CRISPR, which is found under the treatments and access heading on the same page. So right next to where all the resources were for this past week. And then remember to go ahead and talk with everyone else on Slack about what you see there. Okay. So as I said, I want to kind of wrap up so we can be done on time, but certainly happy to stick around for people that have comments and questions to ask.
Thank you so much, Robin. I'm going to do some wrapping up. We will stay around, but I did put some things in the chat. I have the Slack app available for you guys to join the conversation. Dr. Gordon also shared a lot of her research that she's already doing locally. And I thank so much again, all of our panelists for coming. I do want to acknowledge our MNPS esteemed teacher leaders. Thank you guys for joining us today. And I want to also, if you please do our survey for our Gene Educator, and encourage you to go and watch the video. If you haven't seen the complete series, it is available for educators at the PBS Learning Media to watch the full series, as well as all the lesson plans and links to pgEd's lessons that are available. You can also, if you're a member at NPT, you can also access the full series through our our passport and see the full series there. And of course, we also want to acknowledge the sponsors for the film. And a special thanks to WETA for making a grant possible to bring this programming to our local educators to encourage a conversation as well as professional development among educators within genetics and STEAM here in Nashville. Also want to thank our local educators and our more Eastern regional educators at Vanderbilt Genetics Institute, Meharry Medical College, Personal Genetics Education Project, pgEd, and of course again Metro STEAM.